when you come to what we're reading here in the scriptures, Sanskrit is in these verses. And it's in these verses because prior to the writing of this, India, unlike any other culture that I'm aware of, had a long oral tradition that had within it a check and balance system. So when we're wondering how old the Gita is, we can say that if you were in the West, most Western scholars will say the Gita is anywhere from 2,500 to 2,900 years old. So that's pretty old, okay? And that is based on that the first Gita, actual physical manuscript that we have, they can look at it, they can carbon date it, they can see the way the Sanskrit is written and say that style of Sanskrit and the way that it was written came from this age. But there's one trick. If you were to go to India, everyone there said everything is 5,000, 6,000 years old, okay? And that is because prior to that 2,900 years old, where we actually have a physical thing, there was this long oral tradition. What would happen was they literally divided their society into a caste system and said, the Brahmins, the Brahmins, it is your job to maintain the spiritual education of society. And so what Brahmin priests or gurus would do, teachers would do, is they would say, for my life, for my dedication, I am going to devote my life to memorizing these scriptures, forwards, backwards, every other word, every third word. And in the process of chanting the vibration of the Sanskrit in these sacred words, that process itself was the process that they used for enlightenment. This is also where the guru-disciple relationship came in, because the guru would make a commitment to say, before I die, I'm going to make sure that I have a student that is going to memorize this. And that student is going to be dedicated to saying before they die, they're going to make sure they have a student or more who is dedicated to memorizing this and using this process as a process of enlightenment. Therefore, we have these scriptures that come in poem form, because it's much easier to memorize a poem or a song than it is to just memorize like a textbook, right? There's also a check and balance system in this, because if you actually begin to know Sanskrit, Sanskrit is actually based in, again, sacred geometry. Sanskrit uses the same binary code that our computers use. And in terms of actually trying to get to know a language, Sanskrit is actually a relatively easy language to get to know because it really makes sense. It's very logical, and it uses all these bases of sound and vibration and math to come together to create meaning. So in this check and balance, if you're chanting Sanskrit and you chant the first verse and then suddenly you get along to the third verse, if you've chanted the first verse wrong, the third verse won't match. So if something goes, okay, it's not matching up. So it's another way in which there's a check and balance. It wasn't until the 1800s that we actually got our first copies of the Gita in English. And of course, India was under British rule, and at first it was believed that, of course, the Indians were relatively savage and there wasn't much to the culture, but then some scholars decided to say, maybe there's something interesting here. So Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was a part of this group of British scholars and American scholars who decided, who formed the Theosophical Society. They were also the beginning of the existential movement, which was the beginning of the New Age as we know it, and thinking out of the box in terms of Christianity. And they were interested in studying these scriptures to see if there was something there. So they got them translated, and they started to work with the Bhagavad Gita and a number of other scriptures. But Ralph Waldo Emerson is quoted many times in many different ways as saying, wow, we don't have anything like this. This scripture, it's unlike any scripture on the planet. That Shakespeare pales in comparison, seems infantile, seems juvenile in comparison to what is in the scripture. Once you begin to know that about Ralph Waldo Emerson, you begin to look at his philosophy and you realize it's really rooted in the Bhagavad Gita. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson had a main student that most of you probably know, which was Henry David Thoreau. So he was the next generation. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was his teacher. And when Henry David Thoreau went away to, I always want to say Golden Pond, Walden Pond, and mixing up my genres there, he took one book with him. One, the Bhagavad Gita. Okay? So he really was on this thing of scarcity and going into the woods with nothing, but he took one book with him. If you have read the Gita and then you read Thoreau's writings, you know that this man is simply speaking about the Gita. Now we go back to India for a moment, and Gandhi, who was also born in the 1800s, at the time when Gandhi was born, he was busy being raised in a culture that at this time was sort of shunning their own culture. And so he was sent to London to get a British education and to become a lawyer. And he was busy studying with the Theosophical Society and very much interested in religions of all kinds around the world and was studying Christianity. And he got involved with this group, and he read one of Thoreau's most renowned and famous documents, which is On Civil Disobedience. Well, for Gandhi, this document on civil disobedience actually became sort of the foundation of his nonviolent movement, which, of course, freed India from British rule. But what's interesting was that document on civil disobedience was written by Thoreau of his understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. And when Gandhi found that out, it was the turning point that sent him back to his own culture to say, maybe there's something of value here.